That was just a snapshot of what it is that CEOs and CFOs and COOs say are constraints to business. What else?
Well, they also indicated that some of the interventions that they've implemented over the last couple of months to actually reduce the impact of the global economic downturn had mixed results. Some which they thought would be successful are, for example, integrating in business in the rest of Africa, but that wasn't as successful as they hoped. Whilst other measures such as R&D and investing in R&D and focusing on core business seem to have paid off quite a bit more. Other issues that they've raised is corruption. That was very, very high on the list, and it seems to be almost more important than other economic issues such as tax breaks, incentives, etc. in stimulating the economy.
Why do they feel that governments are not taking the issue seriously?
Well, about 75% of the responses that we said or that we got back indicated that they felt that government wasn't doing enough to reduce crime and corruption, and specifically the perception that the rest of the world has around Africa and about doing business in Africa. And they also felt that that impacted specifically on their ability to do business in their businesses.
You know, sometimes I feel we need to distinguish between corruption, which is there and we can't dismiss it, and just bureaucracy and red tape in getting deals done, in getting businesses set up, in getting through regulation. Do they draw a distinction between those issues?
That was definitely something that we highlighted separately, and the indications that we got back was that companies felt that there's been an improvement in those areas, and that some African countries has made definite progression to reduce the hurdles that you have to jump over to get a business going. So there was a distinction between the two.
Okay, costs and managing costs has been a theme throughout 2010, and we've seen companies reducing their staff complement. We've seen, focus on things like overheads, electricity prices. How have they managed these issues?
It was very interesting to see what businesses in Africa see as the major cost drivers at the moment. It was a bit of a surprise to us. Electricity prices, commodity prices didn't seem to be as important as it was in the past. It was definitely there, and it was one of their major costs, but almost 80% of them ranked labour costs and the increase in labour costs as one of the major cost concerns at this point in time.
You mentioned that business leaders would like to see better integration of regional economies so that there's flexible labor mobility and it's easier to repatriate capital and the like. What do they feel needs to be done by governments? Because essentially that's a government initiative.
Yes. Well, some of the suggestions that came through is that there should be sharing and more of these trade shows and opportunities for businesses to come together, but that should actually be attended by the heads of state as well. They specifically mentioned that government should get involved in that, and it should not only be business that's involved in that. And that, the impediments that there are for skilled labour in particular to be able to move between countries should be reduced.
Okay, and in terms of attracting FDI, obviously many of them are already invested in these economies. What would they like to see in terms of making sure that investments go further? Tariff reductions, those sorts of issues?
That wasn't as high on the agenda as we thought it would be. Some things that seem to be the most important is macroeconomic stability, political stability, and reducing the perceptions around fraud and crime in the countries. A tariff and taxes was important, but not as important as we would expect it to be.
Perennial themes, Andrew. Manage the governance, introduce best practice, and people will bring their money to Africa. Everybody's banging on about this. Why aren't we getting it right?
Well, I think in a South African context, it's a big issue. If you look at mining and you look at healthcare, to attract external players it's not just about sound policy, but consistency in that policy and clear messages coming out. And that's maybe something that's been lacking in the South African context and something that is acting as an impediment. And you talk about foreign direct investment, we've unfortunately not been a beneficiary of massive amounts of that, although we've seen lots of portfolio flows. The other thing I would imagine from a South African context that must be a concern is labour market flexibility, and not just the transience of labour, but rather just the ability to manage businesses without there being too much pressure from labour unions, and that's obviously a concern.
If we're not seeing a lot of FDI coming into South Africa and indeed into the rest of Africa, is it a function of the problems in Africa, or is it a fact that many investors want to go to Asia? It's hot, hot terrain at the moment.
I think it is, but at the same time, Africa and sub-Saharan Africa specifically is attracting huge amounts of money for foreign direct investment. So I don't think it would be true to say it's not coming. In the South African context, we seem to be behind the curve slightly, and I think, as we mentioned, if you look at competitiveness in our economy, there are certain aspects to it, including education, as we said, labour market flexibility, where there are big question marks, and unfortunately, those can be potential barriers barriers for people to come and commit their money long term.
Other avenues for FDI, for instance, is what we've seen in the form of mergers and acquisitions, where big companies acquire African companies for, really vast sums of money in dollars. In terms of going forward, are we likely to see consolidation in that respect?
Well, there's been indications that companies expect that hopefully to continue. They view that as an important factor that can drive growth in Africa. So it was up there on their list of things that they think that can happen and that might spur on growth. But once again, having said that, it didn't seem to be as important as just sorting the house out, and it seems the other things will kind of follow. That seems to be their view.
Other issues is the environmental sustainability. Climate change has become a real issue of the 21st century, and certainly this decade. How important was that?
We were quite surprised to see that the majority of companies, more than half of them, actually indicated that they have a strategy in place and that they feel that they're implementing it effectively. So that was quite a surprise. It was higher for South African companies than for the rest of Africa, but the rest of Africa was also involved, and they indicated that we have a strategy and that we're doing something about it, definitely.
This is an important issue, Andrew, when you consider that the three leading economies in Africa, and I think I say this every day on the show, and our viewers must be getting tired of me saying it, we've got an energy supply crisis. I mean, despite all their best efforts, Eskom said from their part, in terms of production and transmission, and generation, they can only guarantee electricity till 2013. The consumer has to come to the party, they keep on insisting. Kenya's looking at all sorts of alternative energies, and Nigeria, we know, is a net importer of fuel, and they're now looking into whether or not they can use gas to power the electricity. But this is a major, major issue. And so we're talking cogeneration, companies coming to the party in terms of being part of the solution.
It certainly is, and I think you saw Anglo-American came out quite recently in the last day or two saying that private sources of energy were the way forward and that they would need it for their electricity supply. We saw sort of a few years back when the lights went out, quite literally, South Africa was growing at 6% per annum. Now, if one looks at Mr. Patel's growth plan, if you look at the government's ambitions to grow the economy by 500,000 jobs a year, we need to grow at probably, I'd say, north of 6 to 7% per annum. The last time we got there, the lights went out. So it's a huge, huge question, and it would be an impediment to doing business. The private sector sort of collaboration in that space has to be something that is part of the solution.
Survival strategies, Lulu, and where companies see their growth coming from, many are arguing it's time to take the African continent seriously as a new frontier. The only problem is that trade is not so easy in Africa because of infrastructure concerns. Yes. What did they say about this issue?
Well, infrastructure, two major avenues which they felt was very important to enable them to grow their businesses. Energy being the one, and then of course transport. And a little further back in third place was labour, in particularly skilled labour, especially if we're looking at the tertiary sector. Banking and financial institutions indicated that that was of particular importance to them. But definitely transport and the energy infrastructure having to be in place.
Just before I bring Andrew into this question of skilled labour and the emphasis on labour mobility, is that one way to circumvent the problem?
It is definitely something that they've highlighted. Once again, it's not something that I think that is so easy to actually get a solution to. If we just look at how many agreements and trade agreements, etc., is in place in Africa, I'm not sure Africa actually knows what's going on in Africa, so we have to sort that out first.
And then in terms of intra-African trade, we know that that's growing at a snail's pace, but we have seen Africa's trade with the BRIC economies, particularly India and China, growing exponentially, which now accounts for about 30% of Africa's trade with the world.
Whilst I don't want to be pinned as cynical, the only issue that one has to watch over there is that the nature of that trade is sort of resources, but there's nothing going back to Asia really. So unfortunately, maybe a little bit one-sided, and we've spoken about it on this program before, that the issue is African leadership need to make sure that the trade agreements that they get in place are fair. Getting access to the Asian markets is another thing altogether, and I don't think anybody's cracked it. But at the same time, you don't want monodirectional traffic, and that makes up all the trade in that space.